Falling iguana season, female adventurers throughout history, and what you say when you need to run a quick errand in Iceland. I'm Alicia Underly-Nelson, and welcome to another episode of Travel Tomorrow, a podcast about what's new and what's next in travel and how those trends influence everyday life. My friend Joe Bauer joins us from Berlin. What are you baking this week, Joe?
What am I baking? Well, I did my usual Friday challah and got the ingredients for a couple of other dishes.
Cool. I think we need to share photos in our Instagram feed so that if people don't follow you personally, then they can see all the cool things.
People don't follow me personally?
They might not.
You mean 4,000 whatever I have followers isn't the world?
Believe it or not, Joe, there are other people out there.
I can't understand.
Because I really think that everybody needs to see pictures of your bread because it's gorgeous.
It is gorgeous, but honestly, anybody who follows me, it's more than likely for glimpses of my dog.
That's true.
I have no delusions of Instagram grandeur. It's all about Moses.
Yeah, well, dogs and kids are like that. Like everybody is like, oh, look, it's that person that I used to be friends with, but they brought the adorable dog for me today. Like, or the child or whatever it is. Like once you bring another entity into your home that is younger and cuter than you, it's all over. You're kind of irrelevant. It's the way it goes.
But you know what isn't cute and is also an animal, really trying hard on the segue, is an iguana. Can I take us over to our first stop?
Please do.
Now boarding.
It's frozen iguana season once again in Florida, and yes, that is actually a thing. The National Weather Service in Miami made news again by issuing a warning about falling iguanas. Iguanas can't regulate their own body temperature, so once it gets colder than about 45 degrees Fahrenheit, they go into a dormant state and just tumble off of trees and come crashing down on people's heads. They look dead, but my friends, they are not. So residents and travelers, who must have thought this was some sort of a plague straight out of ancient Egypt, are warned to leave them where they fall, because once they warm up, they'll pop right up again. A good example of this, stories circulated about a man loading up his car with iguanas to bring them home for dinner. Iguana, in case you don't know, is popular in Mexico, Central and South America, and the Caribbean. We'll include a recipe in our show notes. When the iguanas woke up, they freaked the dude out and he crashed the car. No word on whether humans or iguanas were harmed. You know, it's interesting that you made the straight out of ancient Egypt comparison because the past two parshas have been about the plagues of ancient Egypt. So this actually happened at the exact same time as people were reading about that story again. Look at the things I know.
Oh, it's like I knew what you were reading. It's impressive, sir.
Thank you. I'm awaiting my gold star. Which, now that I say that, it sounds like a really bad pun. I did not mean that for it to be a pun. Just a general gold, yay, kindergarten star kind of thing.
Now boarding.
Solo female travel was a huge trend last year, and projections for 2020 show lots of energy behind female-only tour companies, lodging options, and itineraries that are all arranged to help and inspire women to go it on their own. My question is, do we really need all of this specialized marketing and all these products in the age of feminism? And why are we sending different messages to male and female travelers? We've come a long way since the days when women could only travel with a male chaperone. And even then, it was only upper-class women that could move with a certain amount of freedom, unless you were going to market with things to sell. So we've come a long way since those days, and travel planning info is more available for everyone and more affordable for the common person than at any point in history. And honestly, there have always been women who have blazed their own trails and kind of ignored whatever society was telling them and traveled and explored all over the world anyway. So I talked to writer Ailsa Ross, who's the author of The Girl Who Rode a Shark and Other Stories of Daring Women, about who some of these daring women throughout history are, and what we can learn from adventurous women who we maybe didn't hear about in history class, and how we can find and amplify the voices of women who are pushing boundaries today. I started by asking her why she felt this book needed to be written and how she chose the 52 women that she wrote about in its pages.
I think it was because it wasn't until I was about 25 years old that I'd heard of some of these women in this book. And that seems like far too long a time to not know about some really interesting, amazing, bold women through history. So I figured if I could do a book that could be read by kids aged 8 and upwards, well, that's much better than kids having to wait until they're 25 or 26 in order to learn about, the activists and athletes and pirates and aquanauts of the past and of today. So that's why.
Yeah, I was really impressed with the diversity of women that were featured, both the diversity of cultures and also the historical eras. So how did you decide which adventurers you should include?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you noticed that. That was something I really wanted to focus on, was having people from all around the world be in the book and from all across the ages as far as is possible. And so it required quite a lot of research, I would say. I was really trying to dig into ancient history, and so finding, a travel writer who lived in Japan 1,000 years ago, and then a pirate who lived in the Mediterranean 2,000 years ago. And so it was just lots of research, really. And then in terms of covering women from all around the world, it took some research, but it was all the stories were there once you started digging in. And so, yeah, I could find stories of women doing bold, amazing things up above Siberia and in lots of countries in Africa and in Indigenous Australia. All those stories exist. And yeah, it doesn't take too much work to go and discover them, but you do have to put in some work.
So did you discover any favorites, and why were they your favorites?
That's a good question. I kind of change my favorites all the time, to be honest, and it depends on the kind of activity I'm doing. Like if I'm swimming, I really like swimming, but I'm also, to be honest, kind of physically lazy. And so, after a few laps, I'm like, the hot tub over there is looking kind of comfortable. And then I think about someone like Diana Nyad, who swam for over 2 days without stopping through one of the most dangerous open bodies of water on Earth to get from Havana in Cuba over to Key West in Florida. And she swam without stopping. It was more than the length of 1,000 Olympic swimming pools. And then I remember Diana, and I'm like, I can probably do more than 5 lengths today. I probably have it more in me than stopping right now to go into the hot tub. So yeah, it depends on the women. If I'm doing something and I'm, starting to feel a little bit unbrave and I don't really want to challenge myself, I want to stay comfortable, then there's always a woman around that I can think of that can help me just get a little bit more brave in myself.
That's excellent. Are there any habits that these women have in common that we can develop in our own lives?
Oh, that's such a good question. I would say really like what unites them all isn't necessarily, physical bravery or anything like that, but I would say every single woman is and was curious about the world, and they were curious about the world in different ways, but they've all followed that curiosity and tried to see where that takes them, and even if that leads to challenges along the way. And so I would say that would be the thing that unites them the most.
Excellent. That's a brilliant segue into my next question, which you did not know.
Really?
Yeah. For people that haven't read the book, it's organized into different categories: artists and athletes and pioneers. And I was really interested to see that travel is a thread that kind of runs through every category. So why do you think that is?
I guess, it's probably pretty natural that curiosity is going to take you into different parts of the world, maybe. I don't know if you would think that too. But yeah, it just seems natural to me that that's what curiosity might do to a person. It might, they keep following that path and then they end up kind of far from home often. But it was also something I was specifically looking for when I was looking for these stories. The number one thing in my mind when I first started doing this research was that they would be adventurers. And it's really easy, I think, to connect the idea of adventure with going places, even though that's not necessarily the two things don't necessarily need to be connected. But yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense. So how can we apply some of the lessons from these women's lives when we travel today?
Oh, and like at home as well, right? It doesn't have to be while you're traveling. I think that would be a big thing for me to think about, is how I can bring adventure into life at home, into my everyday, and not just for that, trip that I'm really looking forward to in 6 months' time. I want to feel like excited about and curious about the world every single day that I'm around. And so how would I bring their kind of life lessons into my life, or for other people to do that? I think just ask yourself what you're curious about. And I think often what I've noticed about these women's stories, it's that the things they were curious about as children are still the things that they were following and being curious about as women adventurers, as grown women. And so maybe I think it's really good to look and think about and see what it was we loved as a child, because it might just turn out that that's still the thing we might love now.
That is such a good point. I teach classes in creativity, and whenever I talk to inventors and scientists and artists, they all say that there's something about the work that they're passionate about now that's kind of always been with them. And I think that's reassuring.
Yeah, I think so too. And I guess, if there's children in your life, I mean, they don't have to be your own children, but if there's children around, like, show them lots of different things around them so that they can find out what they're curious about. Because I think if you don't have those chances to, look at a tree and want to climb it, then you'll never know if you're going to want to be a treetop explorer when you're an adult, like the scientist Nalini Carney find out. So yeah, like, help children as well to see what they might love in the world.
So do you have any tips for how we can encourage kids to be even more curious than they naturally are, and how we can kind of awaken some of that in our own lives?
Oh, I think, just like show them as much as they can see, like, in the natural world all around them. And there's all kinds of studies showing that completely by accident, and adults don't mean to do this at all, but they do tell girls to be more careful when they're out. So I think it was some London scientists that had some, like, boys and some girls, and they were playing with a small sized fireman's pole, and the girls were told, be careful, much more often than the boys were. And so I think if we can just, stop ourselves from saying be careful when we don't need to say it, then that lets a girl be a bit more free, and that lets her follow her curiosity, I suppose.
That makes so much sense. One of my questions was, what messages do we consciously or unconsciously send to female travelers that we don't send to men? Mm. And I think the root of that question probably goes all the way back to childhood, like you just described.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's unconscious. I don't think it's anything that we mean to do at all, or that we even realize that we're doing it. I'm sure I do it too with the girls that I know. And we have to try and stop ourselves. Yeah.
That makes sense. So solo travel is trending huge, and female solo travel is on the rise, but there's still that little bit of apprehension about women traveling alone, often not from, women themselves, but from outside forces. So why do you think that's still with us?
Why is that still with us? I mean, sexy is the wrong word, but it's kind of a sexy media story, right? Like, this story does well for newspapers and magazines to run stories saying that the world is big and dangerous and terrible for women. And so they're going to run those stories, and the more stories that you read saying that the world is big and dangerous and scary for women, the more that gets internalized. And it's not just men saying it to women to not travel around the world solo because it's dangerous. It's also other women saying it, won't you be scared? And the whole world can be scary. I mean, at home is no more or less scary than most other places, and most sexual violence does not happen from strangers. It's like almost always people that you know. And so I'm not answering this very well. I might want to redo.
No, I actually think you're answering it very well. I people ask me all the time, aren't you worried about going, aren't you worried about, and then they'll cite something very broad, like, aren't you worried about terrorism? And I'll say, statistically the most dangerous place for a woman anywhere in the world is her home because of partner violence. So if we're going to talk sheer statistics, a woman shouldn't be in a relationship with a man. Traveling is really the least of our worries.
Yeah, and it is often based on statistics, just like you're saying. I think that's such a good point. My mum was just talking about how when I was a kid and in primary school and elementary school, they had a PTA meeting, and it was the most attended one for years, and it was about pedophilia. And basically the Scottish government had released a video for schools to play to parents, and it was like, this stranger could be a pedophile, this stranger could be this one. And my mum and everyone was so afraid, and my mum was one of the only people to say, this is, inaccurate. The most likely person is someone a child knows. It's the same thing. We're looking in the wrong place often.
That's very true. I think it's natural to fear what we don't know, but what's much scarier is the fact that the danger is all around us. The danger is people that appear friendly. And I think if we're talking about, you're writing books for kids, teaching people to be confident whether they're boys or girls, teaching them to be confident in their own abilities and trust their own instincts is going to help whether they choose to travel or not, whether they choose to adventure or not. That's going to give them skills they need.
Oh, a million times over, definitely.
So as we get more connected and we learn more about the world, what frontiers are left for us to explore? What are you excited about learning more about? What are you excited, if you were to write this book, a version of this book again in 20 years, what new categories will be represented?
Oh, interesting. I mean, that's so true that there's no real frontiers left. And I don't want it to be really about, ultra marathon, I don't know, Arctic challenges. That doesn't seem to really suit what's happening in the world right now. Like a lot of those kinds of physical challenge things are not sustainable for the planet. And so my hope would be not that the book would be filled with people going to every country on earth faster than the people today. My hope might be that it would be full of more Greta Thunbergs and full of more women and girls doing things like Greta. And it's so amazing, actually. I've been able to do quite a few readings with different schools and different school children. And when I was in school, like my idols were Britney Spears and the Spice Girls, and now they're like in love with Greta, and it's amazing to see. I can't imagine having an idol like that when I was 10 years old, because there was just no such person who wasn't just wearing crop tops and combat trousers and singing about zig zig on a pop music stage. And so more Gretas, please, for the world. That's my dream, my hope.
That's a really valid point. Are there other women in the book that they really respond to?
Greta was is like a big one that they were talking about a lot, and another one was Jade Meister, who's a teenage girl from Australia, from Melbourne. And she pretty recently did like a polar hat trick. So she did do a big physical challenge, going on skis to the North Pole and across Greenland into the South Pole. But so she was a teenager when she did this TEDx talk, I think it was, in Melbourne. And, she was just talking about how girls can look however they want. And it doesn't matter what you look like at all. It's all about who you are. And it was a really good, awesome, inspiring speech. But in the comments on YouTube, when this TEDx talk was posted, there was lots of trolls, I suppose, saying, make me a sandwich. And so under this video, there's just dozens and dozens and dozens of trolls saying, make me a sandwich. And so when she got to the South Pole, she got her dad to take a photo of her holding a sandwich next to the South Pole marker. And she put a caption on social media saying to her trolls, I made you a sandwich, ham and cheese. Now ski for, 67 days and however many miles, 600 miles, and you can eat it. And they really, really loved that, just because they saw that she was, awesome and confident, and she showed those trolls just who she was.
That's brilliant. The next generation is going to do just fine.
I hope so. I have a lot of faith in them, and that's really nice to feel that there's some hope there.
I agree completely. So how can we amplify the voices of women like the ones in your book, both women that are living now, and amplify the work of people that have lived and written and produced art and explored in the past?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, I guess one of those things is listen to those voices. I don't know if you saw a photo just recently where it showed some young female teenage climate change activists, and Greta was included in that photo. And one of the big news agencies that posted it for newspapers to buy, they cut off the one woman of color that was in that photo. And I mean, that's just awful. So don't cut out women of color from photos showing climate change activists from around the world. We need all the stories from all around the world, amplify all those voices. And so that's a really big thing, I think. And for stories from the past, go into your library and ask for weird esoteric books from 1,000 years ago, because they're weird and they're awesome and they exist. A lot of them are kind of penguin classics, like the one by Lady Sarashina, that travel writer I was speaking about from 1,000 years ago. Her book, As I Crossed a Bridge of Dreams, it still exists. It's still in print. It's still printed by Penguin. And it's just so amazing that we can read words that were put on a page so many centuries ago, and yet they still have resonance. They're still beautiful and full of longing and emotion, and you know, she's having her heart broken by a man, and she's going up big mountains and going into temples because she doesn't feel like she's pious or good enough. And yeah, I completely empathize with her, even though we should have nothing in common.
That's amazing. Great art doesn't have any boundaries that way. So that's what
No.
I'm going to read next. Excellent. Anything else that I should read? Anything that we should explore? Any tips for diving deeper into any particular part of your book? Is there anything that you would add?
Oh, like if I could do something different to the book now?
Yeah, like is there anything that you wish you could add?
I wish like the one thing I could add, it kind of, because the book is mini biographies of, you know, 52 different women, and it's focusing really on their one story per page. I think if I could make it more clear that, you know, none of these women did any of these things alone. They were all, you know, on the shoulders of women before them who helped free them up to create their own stories. I would have liked to have made more emphasis on that you can't do anything alone. You're always working with others to achieve whatever dream or curiosity it is that you have. And yeah, so I would like to have some more stories in there about groups of women doing cool things, because there's a lot of exciting stories happening, especially right now with groups of women.
So how do we help support the other groups of women around the world that are doing great things?
Share their stories, find their stories. Yeah, share them. Tell other people about them. If you find a story, just like, you know, online on some website that, you know, you get really excited about when you read it, then tell a friend the next day or that day, and maybe they'll read about it and share it too.
Again, that was Ailsa Ross, author of The Girl Who Rode a Shark and Other Stories of Daring Women. You can find the book online and in bookstores, and also get updates about female explorers and adventurers throughout history and those that are making history today on Facebook and Instagram at Women Adventurers. So what I really loved about our discussion was how broad it was and how it applies to people who are traveling, who are exploring, who are breaking boundaries, and people who are just living interesting lives. And I love that curiosity and following your passion are like the things that these women have in common. And I think I like the point that she made that whether we're male or female travelers or not, we can still model these behaviors for kids and make them a part of our lives, no matter what our gender identity is. But that kind of just brings me back to my question. Like, if curiosity and being passionate and setting out to live the best life that you can live is something that everybody wants to do, is marketing just to women as these very female-specific activities, is that progress, or are we just playing into those same old gender roles that males and females have to travel differently? Or is it just a marketing gimmick to sell tickets and pink t-shirts? I mean, what do you think?
Well, please, let's get the man's opinion on this one. It's very important that the man speaks up.
I've been talking a lot.
But no, I do actually have a thought. I think the difference is that, so when you might reference the pink, really anything, the pink pens, and like, so that, you know, there isn't a disparity between men and women using pens or whatever pink product is made pink. So it's not like, you know, we need to raise awareness that like a women, you know, you too can use pens. But I think there is a difference in terms of how people perceive that men and women can travel. You often, even myself, not to being a woman, you hear conversations of people saying, you know, it's different where you travel as a man, different things you have to consider. And, you know, in conversations I've had with women who travel, yourself included, Alicia, I'm very aware of the different privileges I have as a man in traveling in the world, and certain things I don't need to think about. But on the other hand, I imagine that there are situations in which it is perfectly fine and normal for all travelers to be traveling and doing the same thing, where maybe the messaging, you know, about having like, oh, it's okay for women to do this too, maybe that's not as needed. It probably varies very much on the situation. And I'm sure destinations are probably just jumping on it as a marketing gimmick. But I do think that there is still a disparity in terms of doing like what Ailsa, her whole book is about, and recognizing that women have been adventurers and traveling around the world for a very long time, and they didn't need a chaperone to do it.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, I really roll my eyes at like, come for the girls' weekend. We have the things that all women want: wine and shoes and chocolate. Like, okay, you're telling me this is a female thing, and I'm not super interested in those things. That's not how I'm going to arrange a trip. I think a lot of and that definitely is a marketing gimmick, or the pink things, or all these. I think women are pretty good at seeing through things that are actually empowering and things that pay lip service to empowerment. And I think the women in this book's pages like really did. They would not have booked a silly group tour where they all wore matching T-shirts and drank wine every night and, then went off for 2 hours on their own for solo female travel. Like, these are women that are doing something very different. But I think a lot of times when these are marketed, there's this idea that in this space you'll be safe, or we're going to arrange this itinerary in a place that's safe. And honestly, for women, as you alluded to, Joe, like, that is a concern, especially when you're traveling. Like, if you're moving through the space as a man, especially as a white man, where you may be the dominant culture in a place, you're going to be, kind of more or less invisible. Whereas for women, to live as a woman in the world, pretty much anywhere in the world, is to always be concerned about your safety. So for me, like, traveling is not any different. Women, when they park in a parking ramp, are going to take a series of steps to keep themselves safe. I have women that text me when they come home. We walk with our keys in our hands. We work on protecting ourselves. Every single person that my friends date, they monitor to make sure that they don't have tendencies that are going to put them in a dangerous situation later on. So the idea that this just happens while traveling isn't really true, because statistically, home and being in a relationship with a male partner is still statistically much more dangerous for women than traveling in any way. I ran some numbers because I know that sounds like a very inflammatory statement to make without any facts, but Ailsa and I did discuss it a little bit, and the facts hold up. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which is a U.S. organization, says that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men in the U.S. experience severe intimate partner violence, and that's severe. That's life-threatening. That's hospitalization. If you go for less, I don't want to say serious, because any kind of emotional or physical violence is serious, but if you go for some include less violent injuries, the rates are even higher. And that's slightly lower than average, and the World Health Organization says that rates worldwide for women, there are 1 in 3 people, 1 in 3 women are victims of this. So really, the numbers are pretty consistent. So travel isn't really the risk here, or going out and exploring a new place, or pursuing that career that you want to pursue as a female isn't necessarily statistically the most risky thing that could happen. And you have some great stats about how when we travel, and great stories, we've talked about this a lot on this podcast, even, that when we travel, we talk about, terrorism or sex trafficking or these big, scary, but statistically unlikely things. But really, yeah, exactly. Like, people are like, I'm scared of the coronavirus. Have you been to China? Well, no, but I went to Montana last week. Well, okay, you know what? Statistically, that is not going to be a concern for you. But we get all these rare things that are elevated and heightened, and we lose sight of the threats that actually are dangerous for us.
Yeah, I think the difference, of course, is that a lot of these things have been normalized. So actually, to jump off the coronavirus thing, the flu is still much more prevalent. Excuse me, I don't have the flu. That was just a normal cough. The flu is much more prevalent, and I believe is still more dangerous in terms of the number of people who have to go to the hospital and have serious repercussions from that. And we talked about the car thing. Cars are so normalized into our culture that if somebody gets sick from the flu, it's like, oh well, it's the flu. It's flu season. People get sick when it's flu season. And with cars, like, well, that's just a tragedy that couldn't have been avoided. And cars are so ingrained into our everyday life that it's not seen as a threat. But getting back to the topic of female adventurers, travelers, that is something that I think challenges what we've come to accept as the norm, at least speaking from growing up in the U.S. I mean, when I was growing up, I'm sure it was happening, but I didn't necessarily see constant messaging or images celebrating that, women from across the spectrum are traveling by themselves around the world, having adventures. And even though we like to think we've progressed quite a bit from getting away from stereotypes about the women's role in U.S. society, I still think there's a lot of things that we need to overcome in terms of, saying that, oh yeah, of course women can do anything they want this day, being able to say that and actually putting that into practice. And I think the same thing holds true with travel. I still hear, I can even remember when I was in, college, and the woman I was dating at the time's mother had heard about my trip going to India and was saying, oh, I would never let my daughter go to India. And to your point, Alicia, of course there are different things that one needs to take into consideration, but I still think there are things that we need to catch up on in terms of accepting that there are differences in the way we might have to pay attention to travel, but also saying that, not giving blanket statements in the same way as saying that, we would have a blanket response to, somebody getting in a car crash to say like, oh, well, that's, what can you do about that? I think if something happened to a woman while traveling, some people would say like, well, what did you expect?
Right. We still definitely blame women for anything that befalls them instead of questioning perhaps why that situation happened in the first place, why that person that assaulted her or hurt her took that action. We don't say that to robbery victims, like,
well, they had a house,
we were driving
they had
a car.
Wallet. What were they expecting to happen?
Yep, you owned things. What did you expect? You own things. People will take them from you. I mean, we don't do that. And I think that's just, it's part of the way that our brains work. We imagine negative scenarios. Our brains have evolved to keep us alive. And if we perceived a threat every time we got in our car, every time we saw a car driving down the street, we can trip falling out of bed in the morning. Yes, we can get the flu. Every single person that we meet in the street could give us some strange virus that we don't know about. But you know what? We can't live our lives that way. We cannot be on that high alert all the time. And so I think it's great, like you said, to show these stories of people that are traveling. I mean, male and female, but I think especially for young girls and for women that have gotten the message that Ailsa was talking about. Be careful, be safe. If we can tell them, you know what? There are ways that you can be careful and ways that you can be safe, but also live the exact kind of life that you want to do. And here are some people who have done that, both now and also in times when it was much, much more dangerous and when it was even social suicide to do it. And they did it. Like, I think that's really inspiring, and it's super cool to see all these women in one place. And I love what she's doing with social media too, is just showing us these stories and kind of living out what she talked about, how to amplify the voices of women that are doing interesting things right now, who are advocating for change, who are doing really cool, interesting physical challenges to draw awareness to certain causes, who are creating good art. I mean, that is the kind of thing that we can do whether we travel or not. It doesn't matter to me necessarily. I mean, obviously I think everybody should travel, but I don't think everybody's cut out for these. Not everybody's going to swim around the world. I mean, it's not happening. Not everybody's going to travel to every country in the world. Some people might not ever get on a plane, and that's okay with me, as long as you're being curious and you're being open-minded and you're living the kind of life that you want to live. And I think that this book and the women in it and kind of the example of person that we talked about in this episode is really inspiring, because you can draw a lot of lessons from that and how to make your life more interesting and more rich, whether you're identifying as female or as male.
But so, Alicia, if you were to say there is a moral to the story, what would that be?
I think no matter how you identify, take the steps you need to feel safe, and then go. Do exactly what you want to do. We get one life. Life is short.
And speaking of going, I'm going to take us over now to Language Love for an Icelandic word that'll come in handy when you're in a hurry.
Blah, 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 blah.
And that Icelandic word is skrepa. This means to run off for a bit, especially if you're popping out to do an errand or to take a little break. Skrepa comes from the Old Norse word for a small purse or bag, which you, presumably grab whenever you had to head out and take care of something. Or if you're in Florida, it's your iguana catching net in the winter.
And with that, we've got a skrepa. Thanks for tuning in. If you like the podcast and you want more people to know about it, please do us a favor and rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. It really does help, and we really do appreciate it.
And then I'm back for all the social media fun stuff. We are at TravelTomPod on Twitter, at TravelTomorrowPod on Facebook. You can email us with your thoughts, feelings, poems. Maybe don't email the poems, but you can email us with any thoughts or suggestions for the show at traveltomorrowpod@gmail.com. Thanks as always to The Fiddle Revolt for the theme music. And remember to subscribe to Travel Tomorrow wherever you get your podcasts.